Good evening. I'm attorney Lawrence Berliner. I'm an attorney in the field of special education law here in Connecticut. And with me tonight is our co-host, Jane Faherty, and we have a special guest, Dr. Busman, who we'll get to in a moment. Jane and I are in our fifth year of doing these webinars. It's continues to amaze me that there are so many issues out there, including tonight's topic. Jane and I are part of a continuing community of concerned parents, professionals, educators, advocates, parents, and we're all learning how to, I should say we are still learning how to connect with one another and cope during the past 4 years, and now we're still dealing with many issues going forward. Jane and I have been moderating a series of webinars to address issues that are coming up in these unprecedented times. The need to address social, emotional, educational impact upon our children's educational journey could not be greater. And we are here to try to empower parents for the road ahead. Our special guest tonight is Dr. Rachel Busman, who's a psychologist, senior director of the Cognitive and Behavioral Consultants, LLP. She's here to discuss many items that are in our announcement, like school refusal, depression, anxiety, behavior related to attendance. Next steps for parents, caretakers when we're dealing with a child's school refusal, developing strategies, and we're also here to answer your question and answers. And speaking of questions and providing answers, we prefer that your questions go into the Q&A section at the bottom of your computer rather than the chat. This is being recorded, and anything that goes into chat is recorded. Anything that goes into Q&A is not. We've put in the chat section, I hope it's accessible, contact information. Dr. Busman has a series of slides on school refusal that will be available to anybody who's registered. Other information. And before we begin, this webinar is being recorded. A copy of the webinar will be provided to each person who is registered. The information in this webinar does not constitute specific legal, educational, or professional advice regarding you or your child's circumstances and should not be relied upon as such. The webinar does not establish an attorney-client relationship with Attorney Berliner, a professional relationship with Jane Faherty, the Stamford Jewish Community Center, which is a co-host. Dr. Busman does not create a doctor-patient relationship. And by signing up, you'll receive emails about future webinars and events from either the Stamford Jewish Community Center or the Law Office of Lawrence Berliner, LLC. Please note, Zoom is a third-party provider and not an agent of or associated with the Law Office of Lawrence Berliner. Jane Faherty, Dr. Busman, the Stamford JCC. Information provided is based upon Connecticut state law, policies, and federal law. If you're watching this webinar from another state, or in some cases another country, you should consult the laws and policy that are in effect in your state and jurisdiction. And with that, Jane, good to see you. Anything new since our last webinar?
Hi, Lawrence. It's lovely to be back again, and a delight to have Dr. Rachel Busman here as our guest and co-host. I've worked with her over a number of years in the capacity as being a trainer to the teaching staff at the Stamford JCC, as well as working with clients together in the public school and collaborating at PPT meetings. So it's a delight to have her here. In terms of this time of year, I think that it's coming up to the period where children have nestled in for a couple of months. Parents are starting to see some reviews, maybe some data is being collected from different evaluations and assessments. So there's a lot to keep us busy and engaged, and to engage in collaborative conversation with the teaching staff. So it's a delight to be here again. And this topic is so important and so prevalent within the educational community of all ages and all descriptions of diagnosis. I think that anxiety doesn't, it touches many of us in different ways and many members of our family. So I'm looking forward to tonight, and hopefully together we can come up with some really informative strategies and some ideas, and provide some reassurance as to maybe some directions and conversations you can have yourself with the educators in your child's world. Or if you're an educator, it might also provide you with some additional insight too. So it's a delight to be here tonight. Thank you, Dr. Rachel Busman, for joining us. And we'd love you to share your thoughts.
And before we begin, in preparing for tonight's webinar, I was reminded that at the beginning of the school year, the Connecticut Education Association in Connecticut did a survey of teachers coming back to the 24-25 school year. And I was amazed with some of the findings which are so relevant to tonight's topic. 48% of the teachers responded to the survey and were noting that students' mental health was a very serious problem. 39% said it was a somewhat serious problem, and only 1.38% said it was not a problem at all. These are teachers that are reporting. 56% of the teachers felt there were insufficient mental health supports in their schools. And that is an alarming. Almost 80% of the teachers in the survey were talking about how concerned they were with the mental health challenges and the insufficient supports. Almost 90% were talking about increased behavioral challenges at school. 75% of the teachers in the survey were talking about increased aggression and dysregulated behavior. 50% were reporting depression. And against that backdrop, we have Dr. Busman, a psychologist in private practice, who is here to try to address as best we can questions that have come in. And we do have quite a few questions. We'll try to get to them as best we can. And if some come in during the meeting through the Q&A section, we'll try to get to those as well. Dr. Rachel Busman is a licensed clinical psychologist, senior director of the Child and Adolescent Anxiety and Related Disorder Program at the Cognitive Behavioral Consultants, known as CBC. Dr. Busman has extensive experience providing cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and other evidence-based treatment for children, teenagers, and young adults struggling with anxiety disorders, related mental health disorders. She has a specific expertise in selective mutism and has an author of Being Brave with Selective Mutism. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Busman, and she can expand upon my brief biographical sketch and get into her presentation for tonight.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me. And yes, Jane and I have worked together a lot, and it's always great to collaborate. I won't add too much about my bio just because I want to get into the topic, but I am at CBC, which is just over the border in Westchester County. And the clinicians that I work with and myself work with a lot of families and children in New York and also Connecticut. Many of us are licensed there as well. So I'm excited to talk about this topic, which I think, as Larry, you highlighted, is just really important and pretty timely this time of year. As Jane said, kids getting settling into school, and maybe we're getting some parent-teacher conferences or some calls from teachers who may be concerned about attendance. So I do have the slides which are shared in the chat, but I'll just talk briefly about school refusal and some of the things that come to mind when I think about it. And then we'll get into some of the questions that many people have sent some really great questions. It's important to define things. I think definitions really help. And so defining what do we mean by school refusal, I think will help us take this conversation in the right direction. And the slides, we're not showing them right now. They're just earmarked at the beginning of the chat. So when we talk about what school refusal is, we're really talking about a range of behaviors that's related to attending school, right? Attending school, remaining in class, or meeting age-appropriate expectations surrounding engaging in school completely, right? So that could mean what we maybe think of when we think of, quote, school refusal, like a child not going to school for a period of days or weeks, but it also can have to do with a difficulty attending school in the morning, right? So getting out of the house. So either chronic lateness or just having difficulty leaving the house, or leaving school early. So like frequent trips to the nurse, maybe to go home early because of a variety of reasons. So it really can range from complete non-attendance to some of these other behaviors that I talked about. Roughly, you could certainly look at some research studies, and a lot of research studies pre-COVID would point to estimates in the 1% to 6% range, like some estimates around 5% of all kids of school age being impacted. And I think we have seen this in research, and just anecdotally, probably all of us. I know Jane and I have talked about this just a lot more post-COVID. This doesn't necessarily mean that COVID caused school refusal, because it's not causal. And at the same time, when we talk about some of the reasons that kids don't attend school or have difficulty attending school, it won't be surprising to hear that COVID sort of set off a cascade of a variety of things. And for those kids who maybe were anxious around being in school, or had social difficulties, or a variety of things related to attending school, not surprising that that might have been even harder once we returned to school. So I think a big question that often comes up that educators ask and parents or caregivers will ask is, why is my child not attending school? And I'll just use school refusal to encompass everything that I just talked about, from morning resistance to leaving early to missing a day here or there to missing multiple days in a row. We'll just put it under the umbrella of school refusal. And it can be really tempting to jump to, I have the reason, or let's problem solve immediately because Johnny is not attending school in some fashion. And I think it's really important that the answer to why is a child or teenager not attending in a typical fashion, it needs assessment. Now, I don't necessarily mean testing done by the school district. It might, but I mean, we should be asking more questions when a child is having difficulty attending school, because we don't know why sometimes. Sometimes it might be very clear. A child might say, I'm not going to school because there's a very big test coming up and I'm really scared about it. Well, that's great when we have that information. That would be amazing to know that. Oftentimes it's not super clear until we ask more questions, look at patterns, and things like that. So it may be that there are very clear reasons for non-attendance, and it might be that there are multiple factors or something that's a little less clear. And that's when being curious and open and communicating is really important. A list of some of the reasons why kids have difficulty attending school, and this is not exhaustive. So when I will say anxiety is not an uncommon reason for kids to have difficulty attending school. And the word anxiety in my world isn't specific enough to even know what the anxiety is about, right? Because there's a lot of different things that fall under the category of anxiety. It could be anxiety about separating, which means like worries about leaving the parent. And a big myth here about separation anxiety is that, oh, that only happens to children who are 5 or 6. It's actually not true. We actually see a peak in separation anxiety in slightly older kids, like 11 or 12. So it could be about leaving the parent and being worried about being separated. It could have to do with social anxiety, like fear of being judged or criticized in some way, even if there isn't negative evaluation happening, just the idea of being in some performative aspect. It could have to do with what we call general worries, like worries about tests, worry about the weather, worried about climate, worried about people, just a lot of worries. We might see fears related to something very specific about school, like bus, like riding the bus, or lunchtime, or tests, right? So it could be specific worries or anxieties related to something super, super specific or narrow. Not surprisingly, kids might have academic related reasons that are either like very obvious, like for example, I'm not doing well in biology for real, and now I'm really worried about biology. Or it could be, I'm worried about not doing well in that particular topic. So it could be sort of founded fears or not. Kids who struggle academically or have learning difficulties or learning differences may have a lot of anxiety or stress about attending school. Depression, if we think about how depression impacts adults, often motivation and energy are quite low, feeling fatigued, sad. For teens and kids, that often can show up as irritability. So depression can be a reason for difficulty attending school. OCD, which is called obsessive compulsive disorder, which has to do with intrusive thoughts or images that lead to rituals that can be very significantly impactful when a child's trying to attend school. Could be body related concerns, right? So a child could have an actual medical condition. And we also know that, like adults, but definitely in kids and teens, anxiety and mood difficulties can often show up with kind of vague body concerns, stomach aches, headaches. We especially see this in younger kids because they don't know how to say, I'm feeling stressed about X. Bullying would obviously be a reason that kids might not want to attend school. And the other piece that I think is important to mention, and it will set us off to have a conversation, that this is not a blame game. It's no one's fault when a kid doesn't attend school. But when kids do stay home, and this will be in the slides when you see it, it actually can be what's called reinforcing, right? Meaning if we stay away from something that's uncomfortable, like let's say attending school or riding the bus, and we stay away from that situation, we actually get practice and get good at avoiding. So sometimes when kids stay home, even if a parent says, but it's not fun at home, they don't have access to electronics or they're not on their phone, it's still reinforcing to be home. That doesn't mean, Jane, it's your fault that the child is home. It just means that staying away from situations that are uncomfortable become what's called reinforcing. It feels a lot better. I'll say I like staying out of situations that make me uncomfortable. And so that actually can become practiced, and then it makes it so much harder to do the thing that's hard. So when we talk about like, well, what do we do, right? Because I think that's probably why a lot of people are on this call, is I say a lot of times, and Jane and I have talked about this before, catching something early is always easier to manage than waiting a really long time. And sometimes I will work with families that will reach out to me for a variety of reasons and say, well, I didn't think this was like a big enough problem before. I wanted to wait until it was really significant. And while I understand that rationale, on the other hand, catching things early is really important. So catching things early and looking for some warning signs, which I'll talk about, and then also being communicative and collaborative with school is so important. Because really, if your child's at school, roughly they're at their job, so to speak, for 6 or 7 hours a day. You as the caregiver only know what's happening there based on what your child tells you, which is really important data, and it's not the whole picture. So collaborating is really important. You want to pay attention to patterns, right? So if your child is, oftentimes we see kids who have difficulty with attendance show difficulty attending school on a Monday. I sometimes don't like to go to work on a Monday, right? Or especially after a long weekend or even a vacation, we all get the Sunday blues sometimes. And so that is particularly a vulnerable time for our kids who have difficulty attending. So paying attention to like Sunday into Monday, a lot of, do I have to go to school tomorrow talk? I think frequent nurse visits, right? When your child is well known to the nurse might be the loveliest human and not necessarily something, most kids don't really need to go to the nurse all that often, right? So when a child is going a lot for also things that seem more vague, right? If a kid says, I don't feel they get their temperature taken and they have 103, it's pretty obvious they need to go home. But like my throat, my stomach, my head, those are often reasons that we want to kind of pay attention. Like, I wonder if something else is going on. Also, when there are complaints that only occur when school is in session, like we only get these frequent headaches, but only really on school days, and weekends don't really show that. Shutting down when talking about school. Now, I don't mean, so I have a 14-year-old, and when I pepper him with lots of questions of what did you do today? And he tells me stuff, and who'd you hang out with? And he says people. I don't consider that shutting down. I call that 14-year-old behavior, but I mean like really having a demeanor shift or really avoiding talking about school, or even saying, I hate it there. I want to be homeschooled. I don't want to be there. Or just reports of feeling really anxious about going. I think a common caregiver concern I hear a lot, and I think we talked about this, is parent might think, well, if I reach out to school for help, I'm going to be thought of as a bad parent because it's my job to have my kid go to school. So people are going to judge me. And I think it's really important to both acknowledge that's a real fear, and our job as educators and professionals and lawyers and parents is to help our kids succeed. And so in order to do that, collaborating is really important, especially because most kids don't look the same at home and school. They often show different sides, just like we have different sides to ourselves. Sometimes I hear this isn't really bad enough to warrant meeting with a therapist or the school, or I just need to be stricter and then they'll go. Or the converse, I just need to be gentler and give them a mental health day and then they'll go. Or what if I get reported to DCF? So these are all really common worries, and important to still notice some of those red flags and then really reaching out to school and saying, I am really needing some help. And I'd love to collaborate on figuring out a way to help have my child get to school. So it may look like, and often looks like, partnering with the school and other professionals, maybe like someone like myself or an outside therapist, or partnering with the school psychologist or a school counselor. Every school is a little bit different. So sometimes parents don't know. And when a parent doesn't know who to call, I usually say, call the assistant principal or the principal and ask, who should I chat with? And usually a school will be happy to say, well, we have a social worker, we have a school psychologist. And these kind of plans really take both collaboration and patience. So like Rome wasn't built in a day, right? So if you're having a few Mondays that have been difficult to attend, that's very different than if you've had a longer term difficulty with attendance. So partnering with school, it could mean just having kind of an informal plan. So for example, kids who might be a little nervous about separating, more than, let's say, just a typical few days at the beginning of school, an informal plan might be a parent talking to the school counselor who makes a plan to come out themselves or send a key person out to the bus to meet the child and do what we would consider a warm handoff. Like, Jane, it's so good to see you. I'm so excited for you to be at school today. If it was a middle schooler, we would not talk like that because that wouldn't be cool. We'd just say like, Jane, you're here. Like, I need some help. I think we can go down to the X office and maybe grab a snack. So like just the handoff can sometimes pave the way for an easier transition, paired with some nice positive reinforcement. Or maybe we have a student transitioning to a bigger school and they're not sure where to sit at lunchtime. They're struggling because some of their buddies are not there. Again, a counselor, an advisor, a key person can just kind of tweak, who are the kids available at lunchtime? Could we make sure this child has a place to sit? If they don't, do we need to tweak their schedule so that they do have kids that they're familiar with? And then we talk about more formal things, like maybe having a 504 plan or an IEP to actually have more formal accommodations or interventions within a plan to address some of the things that might be happening, whether they're learning concerns or social emotional concerns. And I think this is where like thinking out of the box is really important. You don't tend to get something unless you ask for it, not because schools are bad places. They just might not think that this particular intervention might be helpful. So I've definitely worked with kids where we've looked at a high school schedule and broken down all the classes and sort of ranked them from most stressful to least stressful. And maybe logically, the adults would say it makes sense to go in at first period and stay through the day. But maybe for that child or teenager, first period is actually the most anxiety provoking class. So then we don't do that. We would want to start with maybe fourth, fifth, and then we might leave and then we might come back. So having out of the box plans are really important. And really the last thing I'll say before we kind of turn it over to questions is that slow and steady wins the race, right? And I know that when I work with families where school attendance is a concern, everybody is often very urgently wanting to take action. Not just parents, school, maybe an advocate, the school psychologist, and I am much more of a believer in a slow, consistent plan that's implemented every single day and moves slowly to build up than saying like, great, Monday the child will attend fourth and fifth period, and then Tuesday the rest of the day, and then Wednesday the whole day. For a kid that has had difficulty attending for many months or weeks, that likely is not a plan that's going to be successful. So I often will say, took, 50 days to get here, 60 days to get here, 100 days to get here. Let's slow down and have a manageable plan that builds momentum. And that is going to be much more successful than trying to bite off more than we can chew and then needing to take a step back. So I think I'm going to turn it over to Jane and Larry for some questions, because I know that people have questions already in the chat, and we have a list of really great questions. So I'm excited to talk about them.
Well, one of the questions that came in to the chat, which I'll handle, can a school district kick a student out of school for having major anxiety? The answer is no. In Connecticut, we have a referral process where a child's behavior, attendance, performance is at a marginal or unacceptable level of performance. And on the federal level, we call that child fine. And that means the school district has to reach out to the family and offer, in Connecticut, we call it a PPT meeting. There's CSE meetings in New York or IEP meetings elsewhere. And that starts the conversation, which is a two-way conversation. And if we all agree there should be evaluations, in Connecticut, you can take up to 45 days for evaluations. And we'll go from there and see if the student's eligible, or if they have an IEP, determine if we need to the IEP needs to be revised. I just want a housekeeping note. We've had many comments. We can't see the slides. They're going to be sent to you after the meeting, after the webinar. So you will get the slides. If you're looking for them, they're not there yet, but they will be after the webinar. That's just the housekeeping note. So we have what's called a zero reject. And if a child has an IEP, they can't be dismissed from school. If they don't have an IEP, they should be referred. So that's a simple question. The answer is a little more complicated, but it's an excellent question. Whoever sent that in, thank you.
So we just had a question as well, which pertains to one we had earlier, which is how can you basically get the school teachers to collaborate with you as the parent and the child to really understand what the anxiety is and then how to deal with it? So how can you get a teacher to understand that a child is exhibiting anxiety versus being naughty or misbehaving? And a child doesn't necessarily know how to articulate their feelings. We as adults struggle to articulate our feelings and understand why we're behaving the way we are sometimes. And to what extent are some of the behaviors related to anxiety, or how can you tease it out related to other elements or things a child is contending with?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I will say that, and I see some other comments in here that kind of talk about that sometimes there's a lack of collaboration. So hopefully we can come back to that. For me personally, when I'm working with a school, I always and families, I often, I think this just maybe is the part of me that's optimistic. I want to come to the conversation assuming that everyone's doing the best that they can, right, with the information that they have, right? And again, what a teacher and school may see may look different from what a child is saying or doing at home, not because they're lying, just our kids show us a different side, right? So a child may look, quote, fine at school without anxiety, and that's actually the reality. They're trying to save face. They're not trying to have panic at school, and then they might really come home and fall apart. So this is where I think having that conversation is important. So when I connect with a school at first, let's say I talk to the teacher and I'm like, Jane and Larry, it's nice to chat with you. And I'd love to hear about like your impressions of so-and-so so far. And I often leave it open so I can hear and listen and take in, hey, what do they see so far? And then that informs me and my ability to be like, that's really interesting what you have to share about Jackson. And here are some things that I know as I'm working with him around his anxiety. And then I will give some what we call psychoeducation, like educational points about what we know about anxiety, right? So you're an educator, you're an expert on teaching, and I'm someone who knows a lot about depression or anxiety. What I will often say is that sometimes kids or teens present with something that looks, quote, classically anxious. So we probably all could muster up in our mind what looks like anxiety, like biting your fingers, chewing on your hair, looking visibly anxious. And sometimes off task, or like Jane, you said, like, quote, naughty behaviors, sometimes disruptive behaviors can also be manifestations of anxiety. So I think depending on the child or teen that I know, I might use some examples that are really relevant. Like when so-and-so doesn't turn in his work, it might seem like he doesn't care about his work, but actually he's really exquisitely worried about making mistakes. And so that's why it's not getting completed, if that's the case. Or yes, so-and-so is doing XYZ and chatting in class, and here's some of the rationale. So it's not around excuses, it's more putting it in context so that there's more of a communication. Like, can we work together to figure out how to help, Jane attend to what's happening in school and also take into account some of the worries that she has about ABC?
So in order to understand what's going on with the child, do you think schools should do functional behavioral assessments to do a deeper dive and more diagnostically evaluate a situation?
I am so glad you asked that question. So I think sometimes, and this is all of our fault, right? So when Larry introduced me, I work at CBC, but I do CBT, and a lot of people throw around these acronyms. And I think that can sometimes be like, if you're in a PPT meeting with Jane, Jane is really good at saying, hold on, we need to explain, everybody needs to understand. We want parents to totally be informed about what's being recommended. But then someone says, we need an FBA. And it's like, what the heck is that? Like, I don't know what that means. That sounds kind of scary, right? But what that actually is, an FBA, is someone who's qualified to do it. So someone with an area of expertise in behavior, and ideally when done well, would be taking data on what the child or teen is doing, right? So maybe we're looking at things like attending to a certain task or completing work or engaging with peers, but it's not just about the behavior. We're also looking at some of the things that influence it before. So for example, if a teacher said pop quiz and the kid went under the desk or disappeared to the nurse for 20 minutes, that wouldn't be a huge leap to be like, I wonder if maybe that had to do with the pop quiz. And then we also look at what the environment does in reaction to that, right? So let's say a teen puts their head on the table when it's time to do open-ended assignments, and then a teacher reprimands them. That would also be really important information versus they come over and say, looks like you're having a really hard time. Part of your plan is to go take a walk and get a drink. So the answer, I think, is that having an FBA could be really important to give us more data so we understand what's happening, knowing that is a time sample. It's not the whole child, but it is done often, could be across time points or across contexts or like vulnerable contexts, so that we can actually see what's happening and then inform recommendations and interventions. So I think that's a really good question.
So Larry, as a parent and you're at a PPT meeting and you've heard about FBAs and you think it's something you want to explore, how could you persuade or request an FBA to be completed, and what attention should be paid to who is going to actually complete the FBA and the frequency? What would you anticipate the timeline to be typically, and when should you come back and review the information that was gathered from the FBA?
Well, just to clarify, the 45-day timeline that I mentioned before is only for an initial evaluation. There are no timelines for other evaluations, so I'll use the word reasonable. But in order to request any evaluation, whether it's a functional behavioral assessment, a speech and language, psychological, whatever, you need to ask. Don't assume. And if you believe that a functional behavioral assessment is necessary, in my experience, which is not universal, but I have extensive experience of dealing with board certified behavior analysts, psychologists, and behaviorists. So there's not one source, but in a school setting, it's typically a BCBA, a board certified behavior analyst. Outside of the school setting, it could be a licensed clinical psychologist, a behaviorist, anybody else who's trained and qualified. Because what we're doing is taking data from the observation data, input from the parents, input from the teachers. And as Dr. Busman pointed out, we're looking for patterns. Is this period 2 every day? There's a meltdown. What's happening immediately before? And or parents, if they're debriefing their child or the child's a good reporter of information, the parents can give that kind of input. I heard the word collaboration. I heard the word team. This should be a partnership. It's not an us versus them situation. You're sending your child off to 6-7 hours a day to school. You'd like to have them come back a little smarter and a little happier. That's a fair deal. And if they're not, we need to find out what is going on. Is there bullying? Is there performance anxiety? If it's the pop quiz that Dr. Busman talked about, is there something? Sometimes it's the bells ringing. You know, I'm reading. There's a study right now at the General Assembly whether we should have actor shooter drills in school, a source of anxiety. And there's multiple sources. There's no one source of anxiety. We have people blaming the smartphones. The point I'm trying to make is avoid the blame game. Let's figure out what is going on that we can turn a child's negative behaviors into something positive. As far as a timeline, I mentioned reasonable. You know, is a month too long? Is it too short? You know, to discern these patterns. As Dr. Busman pointed out, it may take us, 6-10 weeks to dig this hole, and it's not going to be completed in 3 days. So I think flexibility, out-of-box thinking are all watchwords to try to get to where we want to be.
We quite often have parents that feel that the school district have done an evaluation. They have the results of an FBA, which was snapshots of moments in time done by one practitioner that might not necessarily engage frequently with the student, but comes in to do an evaluation. And the parents feel that they've exhausted the recommendations by the school, and yet still their child refuses to attend, whether it's to get into their vehicle to be transported to school or to get onto a school bus. When a child, from the parent's perspective, begins to really dig in and refuse to leave in the morning, what strategies do you recommend, and what do we do at that time if a parent feels that they've followed the directions and the advice of the school and still the problem has not been resolved and the student is showing that they're refusing to attend?
And you're asking me, Jane, yes?
Yes, Rachel. Sorry, Dr. Busman.
No worries. I think it's very, very challenging, right? Because I think sometimes you can have an amazing plan or amazing supports at the school, and getting out the door is the part that's really challenging, right? And so we may not always think of, and we've definitely had situations where there might be a call from someone at school in the morning to the student or to the family, right? That's not the first thing we think of, for sure. And there are definitely ways that can happen. There are certainly some types of school programs that might even send somebody to the house. Again, this isn't always, and this is not always the case, and sometimes that can happen. It's very challenging. I think this is one thing that brings up a lot of distress in caregivers, right? When they are the ones that need to get the child out the door in the morning. And it is, while you could certainly usher a young child or a small child into a car or a bus, it's very hard to do that with a bigger kid. It's not safe. It's absolutely not advisable. And so I do think a lot of times these are the types of situations that need, again, when it's like chronic, or you're saying like this is a really significant problem, when like often getting an outside provider involved is really important, right? To be able to provide a diagnosis, if there is one, to provide a treatment plan, and that may involve, again, therapy, family work, more collaboration with the school, right? That often is like when we've exhausted those strategies, often we need to bring in more sort of artillery, so to speak.
Absolutely. And the challenge is, I think, that the parents quite often that I've spoken to live in fear. And Larry, this is more a question for you. They worry about a child's truancy. The number of days that the child is absent is then considered truancy. And then what will happen to them? What are the consequences? Then the parents worry about the consequences of maybe DCF being involved if the child does refuse to attend after X number of days. In your experience, what is the rule to follow when a child is absent and DCF get involved at that point?
Well, first of all, we're dealing with unexcused absences, not excused absences. Our state law looks at 4 unexcused absences in a month's time or 10 unexcused during a school year. So if we're reporting excused absences, some schools have policies that after 3 or 4 days, you have to come in with a doctor's note supporting the medically excused absence. So that's one answer. The other answer is DCF, the Department of Children and Families, or whatever it's called if you're in another state, they're looking at allegations of abuse and neglect, in particular educational neglect. And what the school districts are required in Connecticut, after so many days of unexcused absences, they are required by state law to make a referral to DCF, Department of Children and Families. Now, in my experience, DCF becomes involved in 2 ways. One, this is a special education issue that's not being addressed by the school district, and they figure DCF is going to get involved and solve the problem. The other is it's a battle between the parents and the school district, and the schools say, we're going to show you who's in charge, and they make a referral to DCF. And I've had many, this year alone, I've had about maybe 5 or 6 parents that say, DCF was called on me. They come to my house. They meet the child, they meet me, they look in the refrigerator. I don't know why we're here, and they close the file. And so what ends up happening, that breaches trust. It affects ongoing communication between a parent and a school official. So DCF should be involved, in my estimation, when there's a genuine suspicion of abuse or neglect, not something that is dealing with school refusal. In Connecticut, we have, in addition to medically excused absences, we do have something called homebound instruction. That's a form of tutoring 5-10 hours a week. It's not perfect. It keeps a child connected to school. There's no claim of truancy because, in effect, they're going to school through the tutoring program. And for me, that's a temporary expediency if we need to get an FBA or some other kind of evaluation, or look at the IEP, go back to a PPT or an IEP meeting. It buys you the time without having DCF, snipping at your heels, investigating allegations of educational neglect. DCF in Connecticut is not an educational agency. They are a service provider on one side, and the other side, they investigate allegations of abuse and neglect. They're not an educational agency. The local educational agency are typically the school district or regional schools, or we have what are called regional education service centers. And if I could just digress for 1 second, somebody asked a question, our school doesn't have a BCBA on staff. In Connecticut, we have regional education service centers, ACEs, CREC, Rescue. They all have acronyms. They serve a region of the state, CES. They're all over the state. Usually they have resources that the school districts don't because they are serving the school districts in the catchment area. And sometimes that is a source of an evaluation. Schools don't have audiologists, so they'll go to the Regional Education Service Center for an audiological evaluation. The same is true with a BCBA. So And the important thing is ask. Don't wait, ask. So as far as DCF is involved, my preference is not to have them involved unless there are genuine issues of abuse and neglect. Educational neglect goes in both directions. My experience is often it's a special ed dispute masquerading as a DCF referral.
In your experience, Dr. Busman, you've mentioned some strategies, maybe a phone call from the school to the home, maybe having a trusted adult meet a child when they enter in the school, maybe thinking about who they're going to be partnered with or spending their time with at a recess. Looking at where they're sitting and modifications, adaptations to their environment. But what things should, or in your experience, could parents consider or be looked at in terms of related services on an IEP that might be beneficial with a child exhibiting anxious behaviors in school?
Yeah, I definitely think, and this gets to one of the other questions that was put in the chat, like things like counseling, right? So counseling could be done individually. It could be done in a group, and sometimes in a group might address some particular anxieties, right? So if you have a student with social anxiety or selective mutism who struggles to talk or sort of interact in a group, sometimes a group actually helps give them practice doing that, right? I've seen lunch bunches or like more select group of kids when it's like helping the child get more familiar or teen more familiar with like classmates, right? Individual counseling for sure. I know that one of the questions that popped up was, what do we do when we as parents don't know what's happening in those counseling sessions? I encourage families, and I don't know what Larry thinks, but like I encourage families to continue to reach out. So if you're not getting a response from Ms. So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so about what's happening, reminding them like, I don't need you to tell me everything my teen says in a counseling session, but I'd really like to know what strategies you're using so we can use them at home as well. And I feel like if I don't get a response within 48 hours, I'm going to reach out again. And I'm also going to maybe copy the assistant principal again in a persistent, loving way as a parent, but also saying like, I really need to have an answer so that I can partner with you. Sometimes having speech language services, if we're addressing social or pragmatic language, or if there's a language disorder that we need some support, right? Maybe we're enlisting some academic support, especially one of the things that often will happen that I see a lot when kids are coming back from being out. Oftentimes I will see a lot of anxiety. A couple things. One, I'm going to come back and I'm going to have all this work to make up. And teachers are going to start asking me like, oh, you're back. You have a Spanish quiz next week. Oh, you're back. You owe me this. And like getting ahead of that and planning for some modification of work if needed, meeting with some academic support, and especially when you have a middle school or a high school team, making sure, again, we talked about communication. Let's say Jane is the school psychologist, right? Jane, who is the school psychologist or a counselor, needs to let the whole team know Larry's coming back to school. Nobody ask him where his work is. Like we care about the work and we don't disrespect history class or Spanish class, but like, let's get the kid in the door and then we'll worry about the work. But like that takes collaboration and a team approach of we might need to modify the work. We might need to let some quizzes go. We might need to provide some academic support, either temporarily or ongoing, but we have to get ahead of these things so that the student doesn't come back and a loving but wondering teacher says, oh, you're back. Where were you? We need to meet for a makeup class. So I think counseling could be speech language, could be academic support. All of those things I see as helpful things. And then I think depending on the age of the kid, but definitely parents should not be in the dark. And sometimes for me as an outside provider, I will often partner with the families I work with and say, loop me into an email chain. And I will lovingly say, Jane, it's so lovely that you included me. I'd love to get a phone call on the calendar so we can all be on the same page. And sometimes that nudge lets people know we really need to be a team here.
A couple of other things that I typically do too is that parents can also advocate to have their own consultative hours with the specialists.
Yes,
They can
yes.
build up a bank of hours on the IEP. Just for example, if your child is working with a speech pathologist, an OT, behavior therapist, a school psychologist, or whatever, or language, whatever it might be, you as a parent can ask for parent consultation hours with that practitioner. You can ask for a bank of hours that clearly it typically is front loaded at the beginning of the year. If you exhaust those hours, you can ask them to be replenished later on. So for example, you might ask for 3 hours parent consultation so that you are also trained and spend time understanding how a teacher or teachers are engaging, collaborating with your child. So when they come home, there's a level of consistency with the language and the communication style, because consistency and routine and expectation also help to diminish anxiety when we know what to expect and we'll all have the same expectations and the same language that's being used. The other piece that I build in too is not only consultation hours between the parent and a practitioner, but also between the practitioners. If you are the expert and you're the school psychologist, for example, in anxiety, and the child is struggling in a biology class, it's great for then the biology teacher to have some understanding from the school psychologist, the language, the phrases, how to help ease that child and make them more successful or comfortable within that environment. So I think using consultation hours within interdepartments and collaboration between the teams, as well as between you as a parent, but to put that and embed that on the IEP so that everybody is accountable for spending X amount of time with you throughout the year. And also within that, if, for example, your student is working with Dr. Busman, you can also request on the IEP that the district and those practitioners spend X number of hours consulting with the outside provider, because someone such as Dr. Busman has a certain area's expertise that has taken years of training, and we do not expect the same element of expertise within the school district because everybody has their own repertoire and skill set. And Dr. Busman's might be different from somebody else's. That's not to say the school of teachers and educators aren't well versed in what they do, but they might not know some of these special nuances. So you can also ask for a bank of hours, consultative hours, for the team to connect and engage with an outside practitioner. And you can also request for the outside practitioner to go into the school and provide direct training and observation when they're having a session with a student. That does then beg the question of who's going to pay for the outside practitioner to come into the district, which is then a question for Larry. However, these are extra pieces that you can request. They might not always, your request might not always be accepted first time around at the PPT, but there's certainly things you can ask for. So any guidance on that, Larry, as to how?
Well, somebody put in a question, should this be added to the IEP? And the answer is yes. I have a saying, if it's not in the IEP, it doesn't exist. So if we're talking about consultation hours, 5 hours a month, 20 hours a year, make sure it's in the IEP document. It's very, very important. Also, adding not only consultation hours, I often have monthly meetings or meetings every 2 weeks built in. These aren't PPT meetings, but these are meetings. This is what's happening at home, what's going on in school. This is what's happening at school. This is what's working, what's not working. It's a sharing of ideas, collaboration. Because I always consider parents to be an expert on their child. And if there's something that's working at home, that should be shared with the school, especially if we're trying to be part of the team. What works at home should work at school. What works at school should work at home. It's that back and forth. And that way the child is not getting mixed messages. We're not using 2 different behavioral techniques or 2 different sets of language. We're getting the same message, whether it's from school or at home. It's very, very important. And make sure it's in the IEP. I can't stress that enough. For the person who said, well, what happens if the IEP is incomplete? Don't be shy. Send a letter, send an email, request a meeting, an IEP meeting, a PPT meeting to discuss your concerns. If the record from the PPT meeting is not accurate or incomplete, request an amendment. I said X is not in the IEP, or the record of the IEP. Don't assume. Parents want to assume, you are experts on your child. You see your child in multiple settings. Schools see your child in one setting. And if something is working at school, they learn something, you should be able to see it at home. If they come home from school, major meltdowns, or you're dealing with school refusal in the morning, something is going on. And we're dealing with an unprecedented level of anxiety on multiple levels in our society, and it's certainly permeating the schools as well.
Dr. Busman, how can you tease out the difference between depression, anxiety, selective mutism, and shyness? Because quite often, teachers will assume that a child isn't engaging or participating because they're shy, versus maybe there's more going on that needs to be explored. And quite often, maybe as a parent, you think, oh, my child is really anxious, they're withdrawing. And what are some of the things to look out for when we're looking at anxiety, or we're looking at depression, or something that might be presenting as a barrier to engaging meaningfully and participating consistently?
That's a good question with a bunch of parts. So I'm going to try to remember all them. So the first one, I love to talk about selective mutism. So the one about shyness versus selective mutism, I feel like that's a little bit easier. So shy, some people, we have, let's say, 63 people on this call. A handful of people might describe themselves as shy. It's kind of a temperamental thing, right? And means like you might need a little bit more time to warm up. You might be more of an observer before you sort of talk and engage. And shyness doesn't interfere in a person's ability to engage in their work, or for a child engage at school. So if a child is not talking at all, or they're really talking to a much lesser extent than they do at home, that's likely not shyness. Now, a little bit of hesitation the first few days of school or after a long break is something different. But selective mutism is something that causes, by definition, a diagnosis of any kind of anxiety or depression or selective mutism cause impairment. It's not just a little bit of, right? I do think when a parent is wondering, is this depression, is this anxiety, right? This is why we have mental health practitioners who have tools. Like when I meet with someone for the first time, I don't only get the parent's story or their narrative of what's been happening. I take some data. I get some rating scales that are normed for kids that age, right? Because everybody has a little bit of moodiness, and everybody has a little bit of, I don't like to sleep by myself. So we want to look at the data against other kids that age. Similarly, we want to talk to a pediatrician, or we want to get data from the child themselves. So we want to get multiple sources of information. That being said, depression, again, there's a difference between being a little blue or a little sad or a little moody, right? Kids who are depressed are going to show a persistent sort of deviation from their baseline, right? So if you have a cranky teenager, everybody has a little bit of a cranky teenager, but we're talking about a pattern of withdrawal, a pattern of moodiness, some difficulties in sleeping or appetite across not just a day or two, but like a period of, let's say, 2 weeks. And often with depression, we see a withdrawal from activities that are usually enjoyable. So if I'm working with a teen and they're like, I just don't feel like hanging out with my friends, I just didn't go to soccer practice, and that's atypical, that's a warning sign to me. And then similarly with anxiety, we all have a little bit of anxiety, and we have soaring rates of anxiety today. But again, when I meet with a family and I'm getting data and family saying, why are you asking me all these questions? Or the kid says, why do you have so many questions? It's because we want to tease apart, is there anxiety? And if so, what kind? And if so, how much? And also, depression and anxiety tend to hang out together because they have some overlapping symptoms. So sometimes we want to understand the chicken or egg, right? So sometimes people have persisting anxiety or persisting, let's say, learning differences, and that leads to feeling depressed, versus a primary depression that can sometimes seem to come out of not a a classic like, oh, something upsetting happened or my dog died and then I became depressed. So I think you're asking really good questions. And this is why we see mental health professionals who have knowledge of this, right? So I'll say one more thing, which is pediatricians are great. And I love pediatricians. And pediatricians often, my son's pediatrician sees a lot of patients in one day, right? Their job is often to help well kids. So sometimes you might go to your pediatrician and they're like, yeah, they're probably fine. And I think as a parent, we need to trust our gut, right? So if we see something persisting, we can say, actually, I don't think it's fine. Actually, can we have another appointment, or do you have any referrals for a mental health practitioner? Because I think those are things that, as our spidey sense as a parent is percolated and we see something that doesn't feel right, it's important to trust that and push a little bit.
We had a question about the IDEA, that stands for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And if you have a child with an actual or suspected disability, request a referral to special education, request an evaluation to determine eligibility. Your child is entitled to what's called a free appropriate public education when they have an IEP, an individual education plan. And we always start with the public school as a starting point. That's called the least restrictive environment. And for the person who asked about a therapeutic program, we have in Connecticut and other states private special education schools. Some of them serve children with autism, some with learning disabilities, some with behavior, social and emotional issues. And if the child is not able to succeed and receive a free, appropriate public education in the public school setting, then the school is supposed to look at what's called a continuum of alternative placements. And that could be another school and district. It could be an out-of-district placement like a therapeutic day program. A therapeutic day program should be delivering the free, appropriate public education if the school district is making the referral, the parents consent to the placement, then that school, the private school, takes on the responsibility for providing a free, appropriate public education. And it's not supposed to be forever. It may be for a marking period, it might be for a year, it might be for the balance of high school. There's no arbitrary limit. What we do in Connecticut is look at a IEP every year, determine whether it's appropriate, whether the placement is appropriate, whether we're mastering goals and objectives. And if we need the therapeutic school the next year, we will discuss that. If the child is ready to come back to the public school, we do need a transition plan, because if they've been away for a year, they may not be familiar with the routine. Maybe it's a new school, maybe the peers are different. So it's important that it be a gradual transition plan from the therapeutic private school back to the public school. And that's the way it's supposed to happen. All of this with the eye on the prize that the child is being provided a free, appropriate public education.
Managing and supporting children with mental health concerns, whether it's anxiety, depression, or a great number of different elements, can be stressful for everybody, particularly you as the parent. Have you got any advice, Rachel, that when you are supporting a child going through these stages and phases, what advice do you give the parent to look after their own well-being during this time, which can be very distressing?
I'm really glad you brought it up, because I had in my mind to remind myself to say this, that oftentimes when I work with kids and teenagers, especially when there's anxiety, parents are often involved in treatment. And the reason is that, and this is a little bit of a digression, but when our kids are distressed, they signal to us in some way, right? Most kids and even teenagers can't take care of themselves, right? Fully, right? They might think they can, but they can't, right? So they're upset, they're distressed, something's upsetting to them or overwhelming. They're going to signal to their parent in some way help, whether by crying or saying, I don't want to go to school, right? So it's a natural inclination for a parent to want to help. Like, that just is the case. Most of us as parents don't like to see our child in distress. I'm not asking for a show of hands, but I'm going to guess it's in the 90s, right? Of course. And so naturally, we can sometimes get pulled into engaging in behaviors that relieve the child's distress, but then can unintentionally reinforce some things. So when I work with families, I often am doing parent-based interventions as well, teaching parents skills, teaching them how to use it in real time, offering distress tolerance skills. And sometimes parents might rightly say, well, why are you teaching me this stuff? Are you saying it's my fault? And it's not. We're not saying it's a parent's fault. And a parent is very much part of the solution, right? Because having a child is an interactional relationship, right? And so I think my best advice is, I think, to be open to collaborating with a therapist, right? And sometimes when I see a family, let's say I see a parent that's really struggling, like they're becoming depressed or they're really having significant anxiety, I think the best thing I can say is something like, Jane, it looks like this is understandably really hard. And might even recommend the parent to have their own individual support. And I think being open to that, we can't, we think about like putting the oxygen mask on ourselves first and then our child, which when I was younger, I was always like, that's a stupid thing to say. Aren't you supposed to help someone who can't breathe? Right? That was the much younger version of me realizing, well, I'm not going to be able to do that if I'm not breathing myself. Right? So I do think being able to, sometimes it's like just letting a neighbor do pickup or drop off or bring a pizza over to your house, like saying yes to assistance is really important, whether it's from a neighbor, the therapist, school, like that's really hard. We tend to be in a framework like, I'll do it myself, I'll figure this out myself. And this is really hard. It really takes a village. So I think that's my very long-winded way of saying to accept help and to know that it's like very much okay to need it, because this is very, very hard.
We have a couple of questions about the youngest of the children, the preschool children, the ones that are not necessarily in a,
Yeah.
Are there any strategies or signs that parents should be looking for, keep small problems small?
Yeah.
So they don't
Yeah, so
become
I actually love this age, right? So I work with a lot of really young kids, and I actually think one of the best things that parents can do is to remember this, like to remember to lead by modeling bravery, by modeling really good behavior. So meaning sometimes I've worked with families where, let's say, separation is of concern and they're really little. So we understand that happens, but it's clinically significant. And sometimes I will see families telling me they want me to help them work on separation, but then I'm seeing the parent look very visibly anxious, like, we're going to go see Dr. Busman. It's not scary, okay? She's going to be nice. I'm not going to leave for a really long time. And I'm thinking, I'm hearing some things that are actually, it wasn't scary until you kind of said this is going to maybe be scary. So sometimes, again, it's really common if your child is crying or they're distressed, they're going to a play date for the first time and they want to be carried and they're 4. I'm going to say, Mom or Dad, she's 4, she can walk. Go ahead and say, Jane, I'm going to put you down and you can hold my right hand or my left hand, right? It seems silly because if your child's pulling on you, you're going to pick them up. And on the other hand, acting with like, I got this. This is a pretty resilient kid. I'm not saying if your kid is crying to be like, oh, well, boo-hoo, you're crying, but at all. I'm a very warm person, but also modeling bravery, even when you don't feel that way, actually teaches your kid, I don't need to pick you up because there's nothing dangerous here. We're just walking to go see our friend Larry. I'm going to you hold my hand, right? Which is very different than picking the kid up and being like, this won't be super scary. She's a nice lady. And so I think parents of young kids remembering to lead by feeling and showing bravery, not just saying it. Because kids know everything, right? Even the really little ones. So I tend to do that quite a lot and will coach parents when I work with them. Like, Mom, you're walking, the parents like, well, they won't come with me into your office. And I'm like, just start walking because they're going to follow you, right? A 4-year-old's not going to stand in the waiting room. They're going to keep walking. And then we can say, Jane, I love how you're walking with me. Great walking by yourself. And it actually like then leads to more momentum. So I think that those little ones are super susceptible to being good imitators. So give them something really good to imitate.
I agree entirely. In our classroom in Jumpstart, we work with children, toddlers aged 2 to 3 with developmental disabilities and anxiety. It's quite often the first time that they're going to be away from the home environment and with practitioners and teachers that the family are not familiar with. And quite often the parents are it's difficult. The first day your child goes to school is difficult, particularly for the parents. In some instances, more so than the child, because we put a lot of emotion into what this day means for us. The child doesn't have the same expectation that we do as adults. So the modeling is really important. And remember, we communicate not just verbally, but with our whole entire beings in our body. The way that we're breathing, the way that we are walking, the way that we are holding a child, the tone of the voice. And when it comes to separating, for example, the first day of school in our classroom, irrespective of the child's impairment or need, we always approach it from the same perspective. The quicker you just say, bye, we'll see you later, the easier it is for that child to recognize, oh, my parents are comfortable with this scenario, therefore I should be comfortable with it. So just remember too that we give off these subliminal messages, even if we don't intend to, just with our breathing and our tone. And if we just walk into a situation with that confidence, even if we're not feeling it, we try and mimic it. And to some extent, the child, as you said, will follow. But things like breathing are important to pay attention
Totally.
to those subconscious pieces.
I also would say, and Jane, I think you'd agree, there's a very big difference between you're going to have a great day, see you later, and you're going to have a great day, see you later, okay? In the last one, you're sort of like, is it all right if I go? And like your kid's not going to say, oh yeah, why don't you leave? They're going to be like, no. So I think, really acting, sometimes we have to act more brave than we feel.
Yeah.
Because our kids are really looking to us for guidance.
Unfortunately, we've come to a quitting hour. We've had too many questions and too little time. So we need to wrap up tonight's webinar. I want to thank Dr. Busman for being here this evening, sharing her insight and wisdom. For those that weren't listening before, the slides from Dr. Busman will be sent to you after tonight's meeting. So I want to thank everybody who is still here and those that logged off earlier, because we all have competing demands on our precious time, especially during the evening. So I want to thank you, Dr. Busman, for being here, Jane for co-hosting as well. Our next Zoom webinar will be on December 3rd. We have Dr. Ronnie Cohen-Sandler, a psychologist who's returning. We'll be discussing evaluations, in particular independent evaluations. So those who had questions tonight that weren't completely answered or not answered at all, save those questions for the next webinar. If you found this evening's webinar informative, don't hesitate to register. We'll send out contact information for the next webinar. Your questions are welcome. This recording will be on a YouTube channel for the Law Office of Lawrence Berliner, as were previous webinars. I want to thank again Dr. Busman, Jane Faherty for their efforts. And most important, I want to thank my daughter, Rachel, who's sitting off camera to my immediate right, because without her, none of this would be occurring. She just does all the behind the scenes work, the technology to make these webinars happen. And without that, those technological skills, I wouldn't be here tonight. So Jane, I don't know if you have any concluding remarks, and when we finish with those, we'll let Dr. Busman offer concluding remarks, and we want to thank everybody for their participation this evening.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you, Dr. Busman. It's been a really engaging conversation, and one I think that we should continue later on in this school year. So we'd love to invite you back. I'd also like to
thank you.
thank Rachel and Lawrence's wife, Debbie, who also puts a lot of work into making these webinars happen. And in the meantime, we do, if you are looking for some relief and to connect and engage with other parents in the community, please check out our Jump Stars social media on Facebook and Instagram. And if anybody wants any further support after this webinar, obviously you have our contact information available. In the meantime, I hope you're able to have fun and enjoy the festivities that are coming up over the next month between now and December the 3rd. And wish you all the best and look forward to seeing a lot of you again soon. But thank you, Dr.
Thank you. Thank you so
coming.
much for having me. I'm looking forward to coming back. And if people have questions, my contact information is also in the slides. So I hope everyone has a great rest of the week. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Take care.